The letter shook in Andrea's hands, its enigmatic contents shattering her world in an instant. Within hours of losing her job, she stumbled upon a secret that would unravel her entire life. Her husband, the man she thought she knew, was caught up in a dangerous web of lies. Should she face the deception head-on, risking everything she loved, or close her eyes and live with the crushing weight of knowledge as if nothing had happened? In the blink of an eye, Andrea Lawson, once a successful lawyer, now found herself thrust into a dark and unfamiliar world. Her journey was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same. The rhythmic click of Andrea Lawson's heels echoed through the hushed corridors of Harrison and Bloom law firm. At 45, she wore her success like armor, sleek, polished, and impenetrable. Or so she thought. As she approached her corner office, the scent of fresh coffee mingled with the familiar musk of old law books. Andrea's steel-gray eyes scanned her meticulously prepared notes for the upcoming deposition. A faint crease formed between her brows as she considered every angle. This case could make or break her bid for partnership. "Andrea!" Sarah's hesitant voice cut through her concentration. Andrea looked up to see her young assistant standing in the doorway, nervously fidgeting with her pen. "Mr. Harrison would like to see you in his office." "Immediately." A flicker of unease passed through Andrea, but she quickly suppressed it. Straightening her spine, she nodded curtly and made her way to the managing partner's office. The next 30 minutes unfolded like a surreal nightmare. Words like downsizing, restructuring, and severance package bounced off the walnut-paneled walls, each one striking Andrea like a physical blow. She sat rigidly in the plush leather chair, her mind reeling as her carefully constructed world crumbled around her. "I'm sorry, Andrea. Your contributions have been invaluable, but in light of recent economic pressures..." Harrison's voice faded into background noise as Andrea struggled to process the shocking turn of events. Before she knew it, she was standing on the sidewalk outside the towering skyscraper, a cardboard box containing 15 years of her life clutched in her trembling hands. The cacophony of New York City honking horns, chattering pedestrians, the distant wail of sirens seemed to mock her sudden unemployment. The cab ride to her Upper East Side apartment passed in a blur. Andrea moved on autopilot, her body going through the motions while her mind grappled with the sudden upheaval. As she entered the spacious foyer of her home, the silence engulfed her. The apartment, usually a sanctuary, now felt alien and cold. Seeking comfort in the familiar, Andrea made her way to Andrew's study. Her husband, a successful investment banker, was away on a business trip to London. She sank into his leather chair, inhaling the lingering scent of his cologne, desperate for any sense of stability. As she idly opened drawers, searching for nothing in particular, her fingers brushed against something unexpected. Frowning, she pulled out a crisp envelope, unmarked and sealed. Curiosity momentarily overshadowed her distress as she carefully opened it. The letter inside was typed, its contents cryptic and unsettling. References to offshore accounts, coded names, and staggering sums of money jumped out at her. But it was the final line that made her blood run cold. "Remember, David, this stays between us. Andrea can never know. David, Andrew's brother. The brother who had supposedly died in a boating accident 5 years ago. Andrea's world, already teetering on the edge, completely shattered. The taste of bile rose in her throat as the implications sank in. Her husband, the man she'd shared her life with for over a decade, was involved in something dangerously illegal, and his supposedly dead brother was his accomplice. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the New York skyline, Andrea sat in the growing darkness, the letter clutched in her trembling hands, facing a truth that would forever change her life. With trembling hands, Andrea reread the letter, her legal mind kicking into gear despite the emotional turmoil. The document was dated just 2 weeks ago, long after David's alleged death. Names like El Toro and La Sombra peppered the text, along with mentions of wire transfers and cleaning operations. Her throat tightened as the implications sank in. Money laundering, drug cartels. The words seemed to dance mockingly before her eyes, taunting her with the depth of her ignorance. Tears blurred her vision as she struggled to reconcile the Andrew she knew, kind, generous, always ready with a warm smile, with this shadowy figure outlined in the letter. How could she have been so blind? Had their entire marriage been a carefully constructed lie? Andrea's mind raced back through their years together, searching for clues she might have missed. The frequent business trips, the late-night phone calls he'd take in his study, the unexplained influxes of cash. It all took on a sinister new meaning. She felt the walls of their luxurious apartment closing in on her. The tasteful artwork, the designer furniture. How much of it had been paid for with blood money? The thought made her stomach churn, and she rushed to the bathroom, barely making it in time as she retched violently. As she splashed cold water on her face, Andrea stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, pale, shaken, with a wild look in her eyes. She took a deep breath, trying to center herself. For a moment, Andrea considered confronting Andrew immediately. Her finger hovered over his name in her phone contacts. But years of legal training kicked in, tempering her emotional response. She needed more information, more evidence. If Andrew was indeed involved in something this big, confronting him without proof could be dangerous. Taking a deep breath, Andrea forced herself to think rationally. She carefully replaced the letter in its envelope and returned it to the drawer. Then, with deliberate movements, she began to plan her next steps. First, she needed allies, people she could trust implicitly. As she mentally scrolled through her contacts, one name stood out. Michael Reeves. Her old friend from law school, now an investigative journalist known for his integrity and tenacity. If anyone could help her uncover the truth without raising suspicions, it was Michael. With a newfound sense of purpose, Andrea reached for her phone. As she dialed Michael's number, she felt a complex mix of emotions: fear, betrayal, determination, and underneath it all, a flicker of the same passion for justice that had driven her legal career. "Michael, it's Andrea. I need your help," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Can we meet? It's urgent." As she arranged to meet Michael at their old haunt, a small cafe in the West Village, Andrea felt the first stirrings of resolve. She had lost her job, her sense of security, and possibly her marriage all in one day. But she hadn't lost herself. The same determination that had propelled her through law school and up the ranks of one of New York's top firms now steeled her for the challenge ahead. Whatever the truth was, Andrea was going to find it. And nothing, not even her love for Andrew, would stand in her way. The Rustic Spoon Cafe hadn't changed much since Andrea and Michael's law school days. The aroma of freshly ground coffee and warm pastries enveloped her as she entered, momentarily soothing her frayed nerves. She slid into a corner booth, absently stirring her untouched latte. The ceramic mug was warm against her palms, a stark contrast to the chill that had settled in her bones since discovering the letter. Her eyes constantly darted to the door, scanning each new arrival. When Michael finally walked in, the sight of his familiar face, now adorned with a salt and pepper beard, brought an unexpected lump to her throat. He spotted her immediately, his easy smile fading as he took in her appearance. "Andrea," he said warmly, sliding into the seat across from her. "What's wrong?" For a moment, Andrea couldn't speak. The events of the past 24 hours crashed over her anew, and she found herself fighting back tears. Michael reached across the table, gently squeezing her hand. "Hey, it's okay. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." His words, so simple yet so sincere, broke the dam. In a low, urgent voice, Andrea recounted everything: her sudden job loss, the discovery of the letter, her suspicions about Andrew and his supposedly deceased brother. Michael listened intently, his journalist's mind already connecting dots and formulating questions. When Andrea finished, he let out a long, low whistle. "Andrea, this is big. Dangerous, even. Are you sure you want to pursue this?" She met his gaze steadily. "I have to, Michael. I can't just pretend I don't know. And if Andrew is involved in something illegal, I need to know the full extent of it. Not just for me, but for the sake of justice." Michael nodded, a glimmer of admiration in his eyes. "That's the Andrea I remember. Always fighting for what's right, no matter the cost." They spent the next hour outlining a plan, their voices low, heads bent close together over the table. Michael would use his journalistic resources to dig into Andrew's financial records and any potential cartel connections. Andrea would carefully gather what evidence she could from home without raising suspicion. "We need to be extremely careful," Michael warned. "If Andrew is indeed involved with cartels, we're dealing with dangerous people. Your safety has to be our top priority." Andrea nodded, feeling a mix of fear and determination. As they prepared to leave, Michael hesitated, then pulled her into a tight hug. "I'm sorry about your job," he said softly. "But I'm glad you reached out. Whatever happens, you're not alone in this." As Andrea watched Michael disappear into the bustling New York crowd, she felt a small flicker of hope. The road ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, but she had taken the first step. With Michael by her side, she felt stronger, more capable of facing whatever truths lay ahead. Walking back to her apartment, Andrea's mind was already racing with next steps. The weight of her discovery still pressed heavily on her shoulders, but it was now tempered by a sense of purpose. Whatever Andrew was involved in, whatever web of lies and deceit had been woven around her, she would unravel it all. The Andrea who had walked into her office yesterday was gone. In her place stood a woman forged by betrayal and uncertainty, but driven by an unshakable determination to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The next few days passed in a blur of clandestine activity for Andrea. With Andrew still away on his business trip, she had the apartment to herself, turning it into a makeshift investigation headquarters. Her dining room table, once the setting for elegant dinner parties, now groaned under the weight of financial documents and sticky notes covered in her meticulous handwriting. The soft glow of her laptop screen illuminated her face as she pored over bank statements and property records late into the night. She discovered a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts, each leading to more questions than answers. The complexity of it all was dizzying, but she pressed on, fueled by a mixture of determination and dread. Meanwhile, Michael was making progress on his end. His journalistic connections had yielded some troubling information about a Colombian cartel making inroads into New York's financial sector. As the pieces started to fit together, Andrea found it increasingly difficult to reconcile this emerging picture with the man she thought she knew. On the fourth day of their investigation, Andrea's phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Meet me at the usual spot. Urgent." The rustic spoon was quieter than usual when Andrea arrived, the evening lull setting in. The aroma of coffee and freshly baked goods did little to calm her nerves. Michael was already there, his face grave as he nursed a cup of coffee. "What is it?" Andrea asked, sliding into the booth. Michael leaned in, his voice low. "I found a connection between one of Andrew's shell companies and a known cartel front. It's not definitive proof, but it's enough to warrant deeper investigation." Andrea felt her heart rate quicken. "There's more, isn't there?" Michael nodded, hesitating before continuing. "I've also found recent activity under David's name. Financial transactions, property purchases. Andrea, it looks like your brother-in-law is very much alive." The words hit Andrea like a physical blow. She had suspected as much since finding the letter, but hearing it confirmed made it real in a way she wasn't prepared for. The magnitude of Andrew's deception overwhelmed her, and she found herself gasping for air. Michael reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "Hey, breathe. We'll figure this out." As Andrea struggled to regain her composure, a flicker of movement caught her eye. A man at the counter, his face hidden behind a newspaper, seemed to be watching them. Paranoia, fueled by days of secretive investigation, gripped her. "Michael," she whispered, "I think we're being watched." Michael casually glanced around, his experienced eyes scanning the cafe. "You're right," he murmured. "We need to be more careful. From now on, we only communicate through secure channels." As they left the cafe, Andrea couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her back. The New York streets, once so familiar and comforting, now seemed full of potential threats. She hurried home, double-checking the locks on her door. Lying in bed that night, sleep eluding her, Andrea realized that her investigation had crossed a threshold. This was no longer just about uncovering the truth. It had become dangerous. But as fear threatened to overwhelm her, she found herself clinging to a new emotion. Anger. Anger at Andrew's betrayal, at the lies that had shaped her life without her knowledge. That anger became a shield, steeling her resolve. Whatever the cost, she would see this through to the end. A week into their investigation, Michael introduced Andrea to Jack Donovan, a private investigator with a reputation for discretion and effectiveness. They met in a nondescript diner on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where conversations got lost in the clatter of plates and the sizzle of the grill. Jack was not what Andrea had expected. In her mind, Private investigators were grizzled, trenchcoat-wearing figures straight out of film noir. Instead, Jack was a woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put Andrea at ease. "Michael's filled me in," Jack said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "You're in a tough spot, Mrs. Lawson. But if what you suspect is true, we need to tread very carefully." Andrea nodded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. "I appreciate your help, Miss Donovan. I'm a bit out of my depth here." Jack's eyes softened slightly. "Call me Jack, and don't sell yourself short. From what Michael tells me, you've already uncovered quite a bit on your own." Over the next hour, they discussed their findings and formulated a plan. Jack's expertise in surveillance and her connections in law enforcement would be crucial in gathering concrete evidence. "We need to be smart about this," Jack warned. "If your husband is indeed involved with cartels, we're dealing with dangerous people. One wrong move could put all of us at risk." As they were wrapping up, Jack pulled out a small device. "This is a burner phone. Use it only for contacting Michael or me. And Andrea," she added, her voice grave, "trust no one else with this information. Not friends, not family. The stakes are too high." Andrea nodded, the weight of the small phone in her hand a tangible reminder of the perilous path she was on. As she left the diner, a sense of unreality washed over her. How had her life come to this? Clandestine meetings, burner phones, investigations into cartel activities. It was like something out of a thriller novel, not the life of a corporate lawyer from the Upper East Side. But as she walked home, Andrea felt a strange sense of exhilaration mingling with her fear. For years, she had lived a life dictated by others. Expectations, her parents, her law firm, even Andrew. Now, for the first time, she was charting her own course, dangerous though it might be. That night, as she lay in bed, Andrea found herself thinking about the woman she used to be. The Andrea who had unquestioningly accepted Andrew's excuses, who had been content to live in the golden cage of their marriage. That Andrea seemed like a stranger now. In her place was a woman who was scared, yes, but also determined. A woman who was beginning to realize her own strength, her capacity for courage in the face of the unknown. As she drifted off to sleep, Andrea made a silent promise to herself. Whatever the outcome of this investigation, she would emerge from it on her own terms. The truth, no matter how painful, would set her free. The annual Thompson Foundation Charity Gala was the social event of the season, a glittering affair that brought together New York's elite under the guise of philanthropy. In years past, Andrea had attended on Andrew's arm, playing the role of the successful lawyer and devoted wife. This year, she was walking into the lion's den alone. Andrea stood before her full-length mirror, smoothing down her midnight blue gown. The woman who stared back at her looked composed, elegant even, betraying none of the turmoil that churned beneath the surface. Tonight was more than a social obligation. It was a critical part of their plan. "You've got this," she whispered to her reflection, securing the small, inconspicuous recording device Jack had provided. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a sea of designer gowns and tuxedos. The soft strains of a string quartet mingled with the tinkling of champagne glasses and the low hum of conversation. Andrea moved through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging pleasantries and deflecting questions about Andrew's absence with well-rehearsed excuses. Her eyes scanned the room, finally landing on her target. David Thompson, Andrew's supposedly deceased brother, stood by the bar, very much alive and in animated conversation with a group of men Andrea didn't recognize. Taking a deep breath, she made her way towards them. As she approached, David's eyes met hers, and for a moment, shock registered on his face before he quickly composed himself. "Andrea," he said smoothly, "what a pleasant surprise." "David," she replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "It's been far too long. 5 years, if I'm not mistaken." The men around them shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. David's smile became strained. "Andrea, perhaps we should speak privately." As David led her to a quiet corner, Andrea caught sight of Michael across the room, positioned as they had planned. She also noticed Jack, disguised as a server, moving unobtrusively through the crowd. "I suppose you have questions," David began, his voice low. "Just one," Andrea cut in. "Why?" Before David could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew their attention. Andrew had arrived, his face paling as he spotted Andrea and David together. Time seemed to slow as Andrew made his way towards them, the pieces of Andrea's shattered life converging in this opulent ballroom. "Andrea," Andrew said, his voice a mixture of surprise and barely concealed panic. "I thought you weren't feeling well." "I'm feeling much better," Andrea replied, her voice cold. "In fact, I've never seen things more clearly." The next few moments unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Andrea confronted Andrew with the evidence they had gathered, her voice rising just enough to draw the attention of nearby guests. Michael appeared at her side, his presence a silent support. As Andrea laid out the details of Andrew and David's illegal activities, she watched the carefully constructed facade of her husband's life crumble. The shocked gasps and murmurs of the crowd provided a surreal backdrop to this final act of her marriage. Just as Andrew began to protest, the unmistakable sound of police sirens pierced the night air. The gala erupted into chaos as officers streamed into the ballroom. In the midst of the pandemonium, Andrea stood still, a calm eye in the storm. As she watched her husband and brother-in-law being led away in handcuffs, she felt a complex mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and most surprisingly, a sense of liberation. The life she had known was over. But as Michael placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, Andrea realized that perhaps, just perhaps, this ending was also a beginning. The flashing lights of police cars cast an eerie blue glow across the opulent facade of the Plaza Hotel. Andrea stood on the sidewalk, watching as Andrew and David were led out in handcuffs, their faces a mixture of shock and defeat. The cool night air did little to calm the turmoil of emotions swirling within her. Detective Sarah Martinez approached Andrea, her badge glinting in the streetlights. "Mrs. Lawson, I know this is difficult, but we'll need you to come down to the station to give a statement." Andrea nodded, her lawyer's instincts kicking in despite her emotional state. "Of course, Detective. I'll cooperate fully." As she turned to follow the detective, Andrea caught sight of Andrew being placed in a police car. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and the look of betrayal on his face almost made her falter. But then she remembered the years of lies, the danger he had put her in, and her resolve strengthened. The next few hours were a blur of sterile interrogation rooms and endless questions. The harsh fluorescent lights seemed to amplify every detail of this surreal night. The coffee stains on the detective's shirt, the slight tremor in her own hands as she recounted everything, from finding the letter to the investigation she had conducted with Michael and Jack. Detective Martinez listened intently, her pen scratching across her notepad. The rhythmic sound was oddly comforting in the otherwise silent room. "You've been incredibly brave, Mrs. Lawson," the detective said as they wrapped up. "Your cooperation has been invaluable in bringing down a significant part of this cartel's operations." As Andrea left the police station, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the city skyline. She felt drained, both physically and emotionally. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the night was wearing off, leaving her feeling hollow. Michael was waiting for her outside, 2 cups of coffee in hand. The familiar aroma was a welcome comfort. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering her one. Andrea accepted it gratefully, the warmth of the cup seeping into her cold hands. "Thank you, Michael, for everything." They sat on a nearby bench, watching the city come to life around them. The events of the night felt surreal in the harsh light of day. "What happens now?" Andrea asked, her voice small. Michael sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "There will be a trial. With the evidence we've gathered and your testimony, it's likely Andrew and David will be facing significant prison time." Andrea nodded, the reality of her new situation sinking in. Her husband was a criminal, her marriage a sham, and her life as she knew it was over. As if reading her thoughts, Michael placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone in this, Andrea. Jack and I, we're here for you. Whatever you need." Tears that Andrea had been holding back for hours finally spilled over. She wept for the life she had lost, for the trust that had been shattered, for the woman she used to be. Michael held her silently, a steady presence in the storm of her emotions. As her sobs subsided, Andrea felt a strange sense of lightness. The truth, painful as it was, had finally set her free. She straightened her shoulders, wiping away the last of her tears. "Thank you, Michael," she said, her voice stronger now. I think I think I'm ready to start rebuilding." As they stood to leave, the rising sun cast a golden glow over the city. To Andrea, it felt like a promise of new beginnings. The weeks following Andrew's arrest were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, press conferences, and difficult conversations. Andrea found herself thrust into the spotlight, her personal tragedy becoming fodder for tabloids and news channels alike. She sat in her lawyer's office, the leather chair creaking slightly as she shifted uncomfortably. Robert, her attorney, was explaining the implications of Andrew's actions on their shared assets. Words like asset forfeiture and divorce proceedings washed over her, each one another blow to the life she had thought she knew. "Andrea, are you listening?" Robert asked gently, his concerned gaze meeting hers. She blinked, focusing on his face. "Yes, sorry. It's just a lot to take in." Robert nodded sympathetically. "I know this is overwhelming, but remember, you're a victim in this too. We'll fight to ensure you're protected." As she left the office, Andrea's phone buzzed with another call from a reporter. She ignored it, slipping on her sunglasses as she stepped onto the busy street. The constant attention was suffocating, making her long for the anonymity she once took for granted. At home, Andrea found solace in the quiet of her apartment. She'd moved out of the place she had shared with Andrew, unable to bear the memories it held. Her new space was smaller, simpler, but it was hers alone. The scent of fresh paint and new beginnings filled the air. As she made herself a cup of tea, her eyes fell on the business card Jack had given her. "If you ever need anything," the gruff PI had said, "don't hesitate to call it." On impulse, Andrea picked up her phone and dialed the number. Jack's voice was a welcome respite from the chaos. They talked for over an hour, not about the case or the impending trial, but about life, resilience, and the art of starting over. "You know," Jack said thoughtfully, "in my line of work, I've seen a lot of people go through hell. The ones who come out stronger, they're the ones who don't let the bastards define them. You've got that fire, Andrea. Don't let anyone put it out." Those words stayed with Andrea long after they hung up. As she gazed out her window at the New York skyline, the city lights twinkling like stars, she felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. The next morning, Andrea woke with a sense of purpose. She called Michael, asking if he'd meet her for coffee. At their usual cafe, the familiar buzz of conversation and clinking of cups providing a comforting backdrop, she shared an idea that had been forming in her mind. "I want to help people, Michael," she said, her eyes alight with enthusiasm. "People who've been betrayed, who are seeking the truth. I think we could start an investigative agency together." Michael's face broke into a wide grin. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've actually been thinking along the same lines." As they began to excitedly discuss possibilities, Andrea felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. For the first time in months, she was looking forward to the future, rather than dwelling on the past. The road ahead would be challenging, she knew. But as she and Michael sketched out plans on cafe napkins, Andrea realized that she was ready to face whatever came next. She had survived the unthinkable, and emerged stronger for it. The woman who had lost everything was gone. In her place was someone new, resilient, determined, and ready to reclaim her life on her own terms. 6 months after the arrest that had turned her world upside down, Andrea stood in the newly renovated office space of Lawson & Reeves Investigative Services. The smell of fresh paint and new furniture filled the air, a tangible representation of her new beginning. Michael burst through the door, his arms laden with boxes. "Last of the equipment," he announced, setting them down with a grunt. "We're officially ready for business." Andrea smiled, running her hand along the smooth surface of her new desk. The cool touch of the wood grounded her in the present moment. It still felt surreal, this transition from corporate lawyer to private investigator. But with each passing day, she felt more confident in her decision. Their first client was due to arrive any minute. Andrea smoothed down her blouse, feeling a familiar flutter of nerves in her stomach. It was the same feeling she used to get before a big court case, but now it was tinged with excitement rather than dread. A gentle knock on the door announced the arrival of Mrs. Chen, a petite woman in her 60s. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands clutching a worn envelope. "Please come in," Andrea said warmly, guiding Mrs. Chen to a comfortable chair. "How can we help you?" As Mrs. Chen began to tell her story, a tale of suspected elder abuse and financial exploitation, Andrea felt a surge of determination. This was why she had started this agency, to help people like Mrs. Chen find the truth and seek justice. Michael took notes as Andrea asked questions, the two of them falling into an easy rhythm they had developed over months of working together. By the end of the meeting, they had the beginnings of a plan, and Mrs. Chen left with hope shining in her eyes. After she left, Andrea and Michael shared a look of satisfaction. "We're really doing this," Michael said, a note of wonder in his voice. "We really are," Andrea replied, her smile reaching her eyes. As they began to dig into Mrs. Chen's case, Andrea reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The pain of Andrew's betrayal still lingered, a dull ache that flared up in quiet moments. But it no longer defined her. Instead, she was defined by the strength she had discovered within herself, by the friendships that had sustained her through her darkest days, and by the purpose she had found in helping others uncover the truth. The sun was setting as Andrea finally called it a day, casting a warm glow over the New York skyline. As she locked up the office, she felt a sense of contentment that had been absent for so long. Walking home, Andrea's phone buzzed with a text from Jack. "Heard you landed your first case. Proud of you, kid. Remember, if you ever need backup, I'm just a call away." Andrea smiled, typing back a quick thank you. She had started this journey alone, betrayed and lost. Now, she was surrounded by a network of support, doing work that made a difference. As she reached her apartment, Andrea paused to look up at the stars barely visible through the city's glow. The future was uncertain, full of challenges she couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in a long time, she was excited to face it. Andrea Lawson, once a victim of deceit, had become a seeker of truth. And in that transformation, she had found herself again. 1 year had passed since the opening of Lawson and Reeves Investigative Services. Andrea stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of their expanded office space, watching the bustling New York streets below. The agency had grown beyond their wildest expectations, gaining a reputation for tenacity and discretion that attracted clients from all walks of life. As she turned back to her desk, her eyes fell on a framed newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Cartel Kingpin Sentenced, Andrew Lawson Gets 25 Years." Andrea's testimony had been crucial in securing the conviction, a process that had been both painful and cathartic. A knock on her office door pulled her from her reverie. Michael entered, a mix of excitement and apprehension on his face. "Andrea, we've got a potential new case," he said, handing her a file. It's big." As Andrea flipped through the documents, her eyes widened. The case involved a prominent tech company, allegations of massive data breaches, and potential links to foreign intelligence agencies. "This could be dangerous," she mused, her mind already racing with possibilities. Michael nodded. "It could also be our most important case yet. If these allegations are true, thousands of people could be at risk." Andrea leaned back in her chair, considering. A year ago, she might have hesitated, the memory of danger still too fresh. But now, she felt a familiar spark of determination. "Let's do it," she said firmly. "Set up a meeting with the whistleblower." As Michael left to make arrangements, Andrea found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The pain of betrayal had transformed into a driving force, pushing her to help others uncover hidden truths. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jack. "Heard about the new case. Need any help from an old pro?" Andrea smiled, quickly typing back, "Always room for you on the team, Jack. Briefing tomorrow at 9. She put down her phone and picked up a framed photo on her desk. It showed her, Michael, and Jack at the agency's 6-month anniversary celebration. Their faces were alight with laughter, the camaraderie evident even in the still image. These people, this work, they had become her new family, her new purpose. The woman in the photo was a far cry from the shattered, betrayed wife of a year ago. This Andrea was stronger, wiser, and fiercely committed to justice. As the sun began to set over the New York skyline, casting a golden glow over the city, Andrea felt a sense of peace wash over her. The future was uncertain, filled with challenges and potential dangers, but she was ready to face whatever came her way. She was no longer defined by what had been done to her, but by what she chose to do for others. And in that choice, Andrea had found not just healing, but a profound sense of fulfillment. With renewed energy, she turned back to the file on her desk. There was work to be done, truths to uncover, and people who needed her help. And Andrea Lawson, once a victim of deceit, now a champion of truth, was more than ready for the challenge. As she immersed herself in the details of the new case, a small smile played on her lips. This was just the beginning of a new chapter, and she couldn't wait to see where it would lead. What did you think of Andrea's attitude? Would you do the same? Leave a comment with your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I'm sure there will be new videos to surprise you. Like and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our next videos. See you soon.